In traditional educational assessment, a scoring rubric serves a specific mechanical purpose. It stabilizes grading. By laying out clear criteria and quality levels, educators secure inter-rater reliability, ensuring that an essay scored by one teacher receives the exact same grade from another. But when you hand that same document directly to a student to drive their learning, a practice known as formative assessment, that stability disappears. The 2007 Johnson and Swingby review showed that rubric interventions produce wildly unpredictable outcomes. On one end of the spectrum, researchers like Andrade in 1999 and Brown in 2004 recorded massive gains. We see upward spikes in student performance with enormous effect sizes, ranging from 0.99 to 1.6. Yet in studies like Reitmeyer and Verchota from 2009, identical interventions resulted in zero measurable difference in the quality of student work. How can the exact same document yield staggering academic growth in one classroom and total stagnation in another? The variance exists because a rubric is an inert sheet of paper. Handing it to a student transmits information, but it does not automatically trigger cognitive development. To resolve this variance, we have to look past the design of the grid itself and examine the student's psychological state upon receiving it. In 2013, Ernesto Pinedero and Anders Janssen synthesized 21 disparate empirical studies to map out exactly how these documents interact with student cognition. Their review reveals that a rubric success relies entirely on activating specific psychological pathways. If the instructional design fails to engage these pathways, the rubric fails as a learning tool. Using their data, we can trace exactly how an inert grid of expectations alters the mind of a learner, mapping the mechanisms of student self-regulation. Without explicit criteria, students dedicate significant cognitive bandwidth to a single, unproductive task, guessing the teacher's hidden expectations. The first pathway is transparency. Research from Good in 1987 and Chambers and Mahoney proves that rubrics clarify the target, eliminating the cognitive tax of guessing. This clarity triggers a second psychological pathway, a sharp drop in student anxiety. Educational psychologists classify this specific type of anxiety as performance avoidance self-regulation. It is the urge a student feels to abandon a task or avoid trying, so they do not risk looking foolish or failing. Panedero's 2011 studies on university students measured this exact metric. The data showed that prolonged use of a rubric significantly depresses these negative avoidance-based behaviors. This chart compares two different interventions. While self-assessment scripts, step-by-step guides, are highly effective at driving actual task learning upward, the rubric uniquely excels at pushing that lead avoidance metric downward. Before a rubric can teach a student how to structure an essay or solve a proof, it acts as an emotional regulator. It frees up cognitive bandwidth that was previously hijacked by the fear of grading. If rubrics reliably lower anxiety, that leaves a question. Why did several studies in the review show zero improvement in final grades? The failed interventions shared a methodological flaw. They treated the rubric as a passive reading assignment. In a 2001 study, researchers handed 8th graders a rubric and saw no significant effect. The document was novel, overwhelming, and disconnected from their process. Contrast that with an Andrade study from 2008. Here, students explicitly studied an exemplar, generated criteria, and self-assessed their drafts. A rubric requires active pairing. It must be coupled with an activity that forces the student to judge their own work against the criteria. This specific pairing forces the student to adopt the perspective of the evaluator. It transitions them from passive receivers of grades into active regulators of their own output. The rubric is a map. Giving a student a map does not mean they know how to drive. Self-assessment and peer review are the necessary acts of actually navigating the route. The amount of time required to see these gains depends heavily on the age of the student. Researchers refer to this variable as the intervention dosage. This graph tracks proficiency over time. For students in higher education who possess developed baseline self-regulation, introducing a rubric yields performance gains relatively quickly. Younger students lack innate metacognitive skills. Single-session deployments almost universally fail for K-12 demographics. to achieve the massive 1.0 plus effect sizes seen in secondary education, like the results recorded by Brown in 2004 and Sadler and Good in 2006, researchers had to implement multi-week sustained interventions. Those weeks are necessary for younger learners to internalize the rubrics language and to overcome the cognitive load of learning how to self-assess. Formative assessment requires a temporal runway. You cannot rush the development of self-regulation. The actual time spent actively applying the criteria is what generates the learning. This high level of transparency does invite academic criticism. Researchers like Torrance in 2007 argue that explicit criteria breed instrumentalism. Instrumentalism occurs when students use the rubric to strategically aim for the absolute minimum criteria required for a good grade, bypassing deep, creative exploration entirely. The review data confirms this behavior. Rubrics do make students highly performance-oriented, but for a struggling learner, this is an undeniable benefit. Gaming the system by following explicit instructions is vastly superior to failing through blind trial and error. Instrumentalism acts as a highly effective life raft for the lost student, even if it sets a ceiling for the advanced student. Instructors can offset this ceiling by pairing the rubric with tools like reflection sheets or self-assessment scripts. As demonstrated by Reitmeyer and Verkota, teachers push advanced students past the minimum criteria. Which brings us to the final model. The psychological cascade triggered by a rubric requires an environment built out of metacognitive activity and instructional time. A rubric is not a pedagogical strategy in itself. It is the structural framework that makes a pedagogical strategy, like peer review or self-assessment, possible. If an instructional designer builds a course where the rubric is only viewed when the assignment is handed out, and again when the final grade is returned, it will fail to improve learning. To harness a rubric's potential, the instructor must actively design their classroom time around the instrument. Without time and metacognition, a rubric is